This segment is brought to you by JigMasters Jigs. When in doubt, get the jig out. Go to JigMasters.com and use promo code PNF20 and save 20% off your next jig order today.
You're listening to Bass Fishing for Noobs on the Paddle and Fin podcast with your hosts Ryan Milford and Sean Lavery.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Bass Fishing for Noobs segment of the Paddle and Fin podcast. I am your host, Sean Lavery, and with me as always is my co-host Ryan Milford. What's up, Ryan?
What up?
Welcome back. Tonight I'd like to welcome our super special guest. His name is David Swendseid, and he is, I'll actually let him tell his story, but I heard him first on Alex Rudd's podcast, and he has a ton of great information about spy baiting. So go ahead, David, why don't you introduce yourself and tell everybody how you got into the fishing thing and whether you've been doing it all along. Just give us your life story.
Sure. Yeah. I'm just going to give you the typed version. I actually got into this I was standing on the street corner with a sign that said I'd work for food, and they just came by, picked me up, and it's been like that ever since. So I feel sorry for them.
Once they feed you, you'll never leave. Didn't they learn that?
Yeah, exactly. I've had a few meals, trust me. The way I actually got into the industry, it goes back many years, about 30 years. I started with I started fishing tournaments and actually trophy hunting and chasing lake records and state records and doing that. That was a big thing for me. It takes a lot of time and dedication, and I just kind of liked it. It's kind of like, I don't know, elk hunting with a bow, I guess is the best way to describe it. And I stayed with that for quite a while, and then I got into tournament fishing and did that with the Bassmasters Federation. And up here in Oregon, we used to have a angler on angler or head-to-head kind of competition, which was two anglers in the boat competing. You get half the day at the front of the trolling motor, and then you switch, and then the other guy gets it. So it was actually a pretty competitive circuit. And then I've done some stuff and hopped around on different circuits. Last year I fished the Costas. The year before I fished the Costas. I've done some co-angling, some pro stuff. I try to keep my line wet as much as I can. So, but I've been in the industry for quite a while. A lure designer by the name of Tom Seward, who you guys probably know him, believe it or not. He's the gentleman that invented the hot lips and the speed trap crankbait. And folks know that crankbait from many years ago. It's been a staple in the California Delta system it still is. Guys are still buying that crankbait. But really good crankbait. He was, I would say, 20 or 30 years ahead of his time when he was developing, and he was crazy enough to allow me to come alongside of him and work with him. So I did kind of, if you would, an unofficial apprenticeship through him. But my interest has always been fish behavior and lure action for sure, and then applying that in the real world situation. So I started that. I did some stuff for Lucky Craft, some other JDM companies, worked as a product specialist manager before there was a true name called product specialist manager in the fishing industry, for Jackal Lures, did that, and then came to home with Duo International. So far, things are going good, and we continue to create, and they're crazy enough to allow me to open my mouth there. So it's been a fun journey so far anyways.
Well, I've officially not done anything with my life.
Well, if you just get a line wet every once in a while, you're doing a lot. Trust me, and actually probably more than I am. Once you get into the fishing industry, they say that you fish a lot less. It is true. I have to fight tooth and nail to get out there. Like, I throw my son into the garbage can, put locks on it so he can't escape until I get back. No, he'll go with me every once in a while when he feels sorry for Dad. But it's been a joy, this little journey. I started with spy baiting probably back in, I should say we introduced it about 2011-ish, 12-ish would be the time frame. I can't remember exactly the date time, but you've probably heard me just tell me to be quiet if I say it too much. But one of the first places I introduced it was there in Texas. Believe it or not, that was one of the very first places. And my focal point wasn't so much smallmouth back then. We caught plenty of smallmouth, caught plenty of spotted bass, but I really wanted to focus on the largemouth for this presentation technique. So there was quite a bit of time and R&D in that process as well. And Duo actually was one of the Japanese companies that had created one of these prop baits. In Japan, they're called a whole bunch of different things. There's 50 of them out there. A lot of them were designed just for the shore angler or kind of pond hopper. So they didn't have per se the right, how can you say, the right utility for tournament angling or for what I can say is some serious kind of fishing. So Duo refined that process, and we came out with lures that were specific to tournament fishing. And I figured if we could knock that out of the park, then the other stuff, the weekend warriors, etc., would fall in suit. So it was a long trial. Believe it or not, people thought that the presentation was absolutely ludicrous and crazy when it first started. It's a 3-inch tiny little bait, and now we're talking about that winning tournaments, professional tournaments. So it's been a real cool journey. I always say this to you guys and others. I really am a fan of guys going out and spy baiting and learning how to do that. So I live vicariously through you guys often. You may hear me say, Ryan, show me that picture of that one you got. So I do that. I'll tag along, follow you around as you guys are doing this. But it's a really cool presentation for sure.
For those of our listeners who aren't familiar with spy baiting, can you give us like spy baiting 101, like what exactly you're talking about?
Sure. So spy baiting is basically kind of like a countdown method. It's a technique. You're taking a lure and counting it down to a certain depth, and then you're strolling that lure or tracing, or in Japan they call it mid-strolling, that lure into a column area, and hopefully that's within proximity of the fish that you're trying to target. So that's the simplicity of it. The lure actually has 2 props on it that counter-rotate, and they cause a turbulence to go out the side of the body line, causing a mixture of water behind the bait. And that water is actually a little bit different in density than the waters that is off to the side, left or right of that lure. So as fish get closer to this lure, it triggers the fish behaviorally and continues to do that as they detect the lure. It's not a boisterous lure. It's not a boisterous presentation, hence the term or the phrase silent capture. It really is a quiet method to sneak a lure into the zone and then have the category of stimulus start to unfold. And that has to do with some fish behavior and some observations and some other things. So we took this concept of this bait and then turned it into a really refined process. But to simplify it, it's a prop bait that you cast out, let it sink, and stroll it through a certain depth. And you don't need to impart action, where a lot of lures you do. Like a jerkbait, I fish a lot of jerkbaits. I do a lot of different dancing with that jerkbait in order to trigger fish. The spy bait or the spin bait actually has several actions in it that are already built in it. So you'll see it list, and it'll just kind of rock back and forth, and that actually gives it a different behavior than typical lures. And then if you stop it, it will shimmy as it falls, kind of like, a Senko. And when you watch a Senko start to fall, it's similar to that. And then, like I said, it'll have some body flash, but it'll also have the turbulence from the blades, and then also the flash from the blades. The blades in most of our models are kind of a dark chrome, not a real bright chrome. And the reason is we're trying to get a certain type of illumination to take place versus just a wide flash. Really natural, appealing bait. As you stroll it through the mid column, it just saunters back and forth, and it just looks very realistic. And then the profile is that way too. I don't know if I've ever shown you guys this before, but I'll give you a look. Here is not one of the first, but one of the older models of a spy bait. And actually, in America, we had sinking prop baits, and that's what this is. It's a sinking prop bait. Now this thing looks like, I don't know, like a Halloween suit with spikes on it, but those are all hooks, and that bait actually would sink. It has a propeller on there that rotates in the front and back. But that bait right there is kind of like the original concept of a sinking prop bait.
How old is that?
Huh?
How old is that?
I think this one is like I think this one's 1950s, I think.
I was gonna say, because I've got like a tackle box full of like old lures. I'm not sure how old, but they're all old, and I got some that like are similar to that. So I was like I didn't want to say it and sound stupid, but like, and like be like, what? I just developed this like 15 years ago. What are you talking about? but it looked old, but I didn't want to sound stupid.
No. So the early 1900s, these prop baits were coming out, and some were sinking, some were floating, obviously. But things have changed. I mean, here's one that's actually an older version too. And I have the dates written down somewhere on these, but this one is actually pretty well designed. It has a fin on the back of it, bent props. The hooks are a little bit large for what we do now, but you can see they were thinking back then too, as far as a sinking prop bait. So we've gone from this to this, and so quite a departure, as you can tell. But definitely we're headed in the right direction, and it's been a proven presentation. So for your listeners that are just beginning, spy baiting is really that simple as far as a concept. It's a weighted lure, 3 inches long approximately. Now I have several different models for duo. In fact, I'm coming out with another one this year. So earlier this year I came out with a 100 millimeters, so that's like 4 inches, and now I'm coming out with another one at the end of summer too. But basically it's a small prop bait that you cast out, let it sink, and then you actually stroll it through. So when it gets to be a difficult technique is when you start to think of it and how to apply it to your tournament fishing, or how to apply it to big fish, and that's when it starts to get a little bit techy, so to speak. But the basic concept is pretty easy. And guys are taking these baits and departing from spy baiting per se, and just throwing it at everything. The bird goes by and they go ahead and cast it at the bird. I mean, they're doing all sorts of different things with it. I met some guys in Gunnersville that actually use a very thick diameter line, and then they attach the spy bait to it, and they're strolling it on the surface or just below the surface on the grass beds, and they're catching fish doing that. So guys are experimenting with it a lot of different ways, but it has a proven track record of winning many tournaments. I mean, many tournaments, from Canada all the way down into Mexico. In fact, a few years ago, one of the big South African bass tournaments out there, I forget the exact name of it, but they hold it and invite other entities regionally as well as from other countries to this tournament. But that was one spy baiting as well. So it's had some success and some history behind it for sure.
Well, let's talk a little bit about like how you use it, or a little more. I know we touched on it a little bit. Okay, so you said you cast it out, you let it sink to whatever your desired, depth, and then, pretty much just wind it in. Like that's all you really got to do. Yeah,
because the actions are, and this is where it gets a little tricky. Guys, and I've had guys in the boat with me, and I'm teaching them. They've actually flown out to fish with me because they're pretty serious pros, and they wanted to learn all the little nitty-gritties to it. And when I start talking about some of the simplicity that you're just keeping your rod still and you're retrieving the line in, you're just incorporating the line in, and a slow, steady, or slow, moderate retrieve, you're doing that, I almost lose them right there. They're like, wait a minute, aren't you supposed to jerk, the rod? Aren't you supposed to work the line? And so you start to lose people there. And what I'm getting at is that's more of a mental thing. It is a slow presentation, so guys get a little frustrated with that, but the rewards are huge. I mean, big fish. I don't know how many. It's over 200 people in the last probably year and a half, maybe 2 years, that have private messaged me, called me, saw me at a show, that have said that they've caught their personal best, doing this presentation. So, I mean, it's unprecedented on that level. And like I said, it over $1 million. I didn't mention that, but over $1 million has been won on the tournament trail with this presentation and this lure in particular. So, it's a firecracker when it comes to that. But guys just have to think about the presentation, keeping it simplistic, because it's already doing the work for you. Some key tips I can give guys is, as you start to develop and become a spy baiter, you really want to start thinking about where your fish are. I mean, really trying to get cerebral about where your fish are during a certain seasonal trend. For example, pre-spawn, they're not going to necessarily be up in the flats in the shallow water. They may be adjacent to that area. So it may be rock piles or broken off road beds or something that get them to that area before they go up and spawn. So you want to target those areas just like you would with another lure, or your favorite lure. But looking at how fish position is going to help you also when you spy bait. You're catching suspended fish for the most part, or fish that are off the bottom for the most part. And I've done quite a bit of research on those fish. Their visual acuity is actually seems to be higher. Their alertness seems to be higher. They actually can see more in their visual plane than if they're tucked away underneath the dock, or they're in a weed bed, or they're in lily pads, or down against the bottom in current. They lose their angles, and so when they do suspend, for example, 12 feet off of 20, they tend to be able to see quite a bit without very much movement. So this tiny little bait coming into their area seems to make a huge appeal. And then when they get close enough to it again, it starts to stimulate them behaviorally. A key that a guy can also focus in on is the cast. I think the cast is pretty critical in spy baiting. It's not just casting at your target. I always tell guys, you want to cast beyond your target, because the lure is designed to, again, kind of sneak into the area. So, you may throw topwater right on top of a tree clump and start working it, but that is because you're trying to draw attention to that area. So that makes a lot of sense. But in spy baiting, if you throw on top of your area, you may actually miss your fish as the bait moves away from that area. So you always want to go past it, and you won't know. I mean, I joke about this, but I'm half serious. There are a handful of pros that I couldn't get them past the learning curve because they weren't casting the lure past their target area. And so, as simple as that seems, we are, as anglers, tend to be really target oriented. It's really nice and easy when we cast to the tree stump, or we skip the jig underneath the dock. We got that part because we're real target oriented. But when you start thinking about casting beyond, and I tell guys, think about it like this: cast 30 or 40 feet beyond your target. And the reason why I say that, because then it gives you a whole bunch of time to line everything up and start your retrieve back into the zone where the fish are. The other thing I get with guys is that, like, again, they don't have a lot of time. Maybe they're tournament fishing right now and they just heard about spy baiting. So I talk with those guys about, because it really is a big fish presentation. So with those guys, I say, split the difference on your cast. So if you've got a stump of a tree that was cut off way back in the day and it's laying on the bottom of the lake in 20 foot of water, but the stump comes up like 8 feet, and you want to stroll that bait just above that stump for those suspended fish, then you're going to kind of split that depth is basically what you're doing. You don't have to do it exactly, but at 20 feet, I tell the guy to fish somewhere around 10 or 12 feet, something in that zone. The fish can see that bait from there, and they can move to it if they want it. The next cast, you may want to be down a foot off the bottom and strolling through that same zone. So in 2 casts, you can really pick away or pull away your target pretty good and start to dissect that. it's a lot easier than when you start thinking about positioning with a jig, for example. You may throw a jig at the front of the tree, then you roll your boat around and you get back behind the bushes and you go on the back side of the tree. Not with spy baiting, because you're going past the target and then strolling it in. So you can really dissect things in a couple casts, which is nice.
Now, as far as letting it sink, with spy bait, is it like a 1 foot per second thing to kind of determine how deep you're letting it go?
Sure. Yeah. So basically speaking, it's a foot per second on most of the models. Now, some of that is different between the models, but if you are counting a foot per second and you give and take 6 inches or 8 inches, you're going to be okay. You'll be right in there, especially when you're fishing what I call deeper fish. And when I talk about deep, I lose guys there too. Like I'll start talking about depth. Like, to me, 20 feet is not really that deep for me as a fisherman. So, 30 feet starts to get into depth to me, but 20 feet is really not that deep. And guys will tell you, whoa, that's deep. That's pretty deep. But all you got to do is stand on the front end of your bass boat and look back. And that's 20 feet basically on a standard bass boat, including the engine. So it's really not that deep. So it may take you a little bit to get down there. You make a cast, it may take you 10 or 12 seconds to get there, or 8 seconds to get there if you have a faster falling one. But once you're there, it's pretty painless.
One of the things that appealed to me about this is I'm still learning bait casting. I've been spinning rod for as long as I can remember. In the past year or two, I've really picked up bait casting, and I'm getting okay with it. But the fact that you can throw this on spinning gear, I know. I think you said the G-Fix was made more for bait casters, but it still can be thrown on spinning gear, I'm assuming, right?
Yeah. So we have several models, but for example, we have a 80 and an 80 G-Fix, and those two can be thrown on spinning rods, and both of those will cast a country mile. I mean, that little bait with the G-Fix model, I think when I was doing linear tests, even with a slight, 1 or 2 mile an hour wind, crosswind, we were still hitting 100 to 130 feet with that on 6-pound test. So you can cast pretty far with that tiny little bait. And then you get into the other models, which are the 90, and the 72 came after the 90, but the 72 and the 90 and the 100, and those are really set for the bait casters. So the guys that really will not pick up a spinning rod, and I know a few of them, trust me.
I don't unless I have to. I carry one spinning combo with me, for Ned rigs or whatnot, but I rarely pick it up.
Yeah, and it's really true. I mean, I remember one of my first Bassmaster Classics that I was attending with the company. I was perplexed to how many guys did not pick up a spinning rod. No, we don't do that. I was like, wow. But I get it too. Some of those guys are very, very proficient with a bait caster, and they've got it down. They can do it with their eyes closed, and including trick casting. Some of those guys are phenomenal with a bait caster. So I do get it. But I think with this technique, the more that you can get to the finessey side of spy baiting, and some guys are now calling it power finesse, but the more you can moved to the finessey side of spy baiting, it only helps you when you pick up the bait caster. It really does. It's once you learn, and like I tell guys, they'll ask me all the time, what lure would you learn if I could just pick one lure? Which one would it be? The G-Fix, 80 G-Fix would be perfect. 6-pound test, 6.5, 7-foot rod. You can use your drop shot rod to do this. You don't have to go out and get a high-end rod and a high-end reel for this. Now I do, but I'm pretty retentive, so I raise my right hand and tell people that in advance. But you can start out with a simple drop shot rod. I do recommend that you get a very good quality line. It makes a world of difference in the long haul. So if you are a fluorocarbon guy and you really do like fluorocarbon, and you work towards those fluorocarbon brands that actually are on the high end side, it really does pay off in the long haul. I invented a line presentation years ago called tee-shotting, and that's using a 25-foot to 35-foot fluorocarbon leader. And I use that quite a bit in my jerkbait fishing, because that amount of fluorocarbon, which is awfully heavy, it's super heavy in compared to braid, and it's still significantly heavy in compared to nylon 6 or monofilament, would sink, and that belly would kind of swoop downward, and that would actually pull in line my jerkbait, and I can feel fish touch my jerkbait. Where when I used braid, I couldn't feel anything. If I had 1 inch of slack in there, could not feel that. Or if I used monofilament and I had the bow going the opposite way, and the bait was pulled into me, and the bow was kind of subsurfaced and up on top of the surface, I felt a lot less fish during that process too. So fluorocarbon to me seemed the way to go. I applied T-shotting to spy-baiting too, and now more and more guys are using braid to leader. 15 years ago, it wasn't so. Guys were saying, "Oh, I use a leader," and I'd ask them how long, and they'd say, "Well, here it is," and it would be 2 feet, and they would say, "And I'm saving a whole bunch of money on my fluorocarbon." So I think guys now have really moved to the longer leaders and understand the benefit to that. But that fluorocarbon will actually work to pull the bait in line, straighten the bait and pull it in line. So if you do use a braid to leader connection, I recommend using a longer one. Also, the longer the leader, you can get the knot incorporated into the spool while you're fighting a fish. So you're not fighting between knots. And I have had knots slip before, rarely, but I have had them do it. Or they bump the guide a bunch of times on the high end during the inertia, and sometimes that wears them out as well. So the longer leader seems to help alleviate some of that, anyways.
Now, I think also if you're making these crazy long casts, the more invisible line you have, probably the better.
Yes. Guys will ask me, what size line do I use when I'm really into it and I'm just going to spy bait for the next 3 days. I have 5 pound. It's a JDM fluorocarbon called R18. It's made by Seagar. We don't get it in the U.S., but the equivalent to that or derivative of that would be Seagar Tatsu. That's our U.S. side of the Seagar, and it's the highest quality that we have in the U.S. So Tatsu I would use, but it only comes in like 6 and 8, 12 kind of increments. The R18 comes in those opposite sides, or those in between sizes. So I use 5 to 7 in R18, but I'll use 5 pound, and like I said, I'll use a 7. Well, I use a 7.6 rod, pretty nice reel, and I'll go to town with my Spinbait 80, and I'll fish like that for 3 days straight if I need to.
I couldn't imagine trying to fight like a big bass on 5 pound tests. I'd be so scared.
Well, you make a good point. In fact, some guys, when I was talking to them, well, what size line do you use? And I'd say I really use 5 to 6 90% of my time. I'll bump up because I want to be able to give the guys the right information. Or if I'm using a bait caster, I'll go up into the 7, 8, 9, 10 pound range, 12 pound range. But for the most part, spinning application, I'm 5 and 6, and I like 5 pound even better. It seems like it's really light, but you would be amazed how much pressure it takes to break 4 pound tests. Now, I'm not talking about shock factor, which is different, but I'm talking about just straight pull and strain. It takes quite a bit. I mean, and if you have the right rod, a soft rod, then that rod really helps you manage that line. I have rods that are specific to 2.5 to 3 pound line fluorocarbon that I use for bass fishing. They're bass rods that actually handle 2.1 to 2.5 to 3 pound line, and I'll fish finesse presentations with that. But really, it comes down to having the right rod to absorb some of that. If you have a real stiff rod, then you're gonna pop that line swinging on those fish.
So we're talking like a moderate action rod, or just like a faster tip?
Yeah, well, faster tip if you can get away with it. It's a little bit harder with the U.S. models. They're getting better and better, especially in the last about 10 years. We're starting to see more fast, extra fast tips that are medium and medium light powers on them. So It's not as common. You have to kind of go look for them, but you can find them out there now. So they are coming about. Guys are doing that. And our actions are a little bit different than the Japanese actions. So what we may think is extra fast may be just fast over in Japan. So it kind of depends on the materials used, etc. But yeah, I look at a spinning rod for spinning application. I'll look at a reel that's like in the 2,500 to 3,000 range, 6-pound Tatsu, and then the rod will be 6.5 to 7.5 feet on a standard, and it'll be basically a drop shot rod, that actually gives. So the medium action to medium light action, and you really do want this. Here's the reason why. You guys are going to be making these long casts, and at the end of these casts, you roll the reel handle twice, and all of a sudden the fish loads up on the rod. Well, now you've got you got the fish lined out, and usually those fish are just under the surface. Well, if you've been fishing long enough, you know that you put tension on a fish that's just under the surface, which way are they going to go? Up. They're going to go up. That's where they go. They hardly ever go down. It's almost like they know, I'm going to make David's life miserable. So they start jumping right away. That softer rod absorbs that while they're out there. So it gives that tethering, and I call it a rubber band effect. So a rod that is soft will allow all that business out there way far away from you to happen. And after you sweat and bleed a little bit in shock, you can turn around and see that your fish is still attached to the lure. And that's where that really pays off. A lot of guys, when they first started spy baiting, even on the Bassmaster Tour, were using quite stiff rods. And in drop shotting, some of those guys have moved to longer sticks that are heavier actions, unfortunately. So because they're doing a lot more vertical drop shotting, they're dropping on targets, bumping the fish, and then setting the hook this way, high posting. And so some of them are using a little bit stiffer rods. But those softer actions really, really help keep that fish connected, and you lose less fish doing that.
That makes a lot of sense. The rod does the work, so the line doesn't have to take the stress of it.
Yeah. I mean, when I think about spy baiting, I say this too, and it is the most easiest, most difficult technique to learn. And I just say that because it really is true. But for a newbie, or for a guy just getting into fishing, or just kind of hungry about learning techniques, it's really an ideal technique for them, because if they learn that now, the progression or the learning curve falls really quickly. They can get around it pretty quick. The guys that have a harder time are those guys that have been out there for 20 years that refuse to do things right, so they get stuck in their ways. Well, then spy baiting gets to be part of that list of refusal as well, so they'll have a little bit harder time. And the learning curve is pretty long. It's from 1 month to I think my longest has been about 8 months, and that's not every day, obviously, but that's guys keeping on, trying to try it and get acquainted with it. So some guys learn it real quick. Other guys, it takes some time. But the guy that is brand new to the game, or is really hungry about learning, he'll get it probably quicker than I would, for sure. They're interested in that. So if you tell them to sit stay, they sit stay because they know it has a benefit. You tell an old timer to sit stay, and he'll look at you cross-eyed, get angry at you.
Well, just listening to you talk about it, I'm interested in it simply because the less I have to trust myself to do something, the better off I am. Let it do the work for me. I think my biggest issue with it would probably be, finding the fish, knowing exactly where they are, and then casting past them, and knowing exactly where I'm where the like the cast zone where I need to cast for, and casting past it and everything.
Yeah.
Figuring that out, I think I'd be fine with, letting it sink and then just reeling.
But you bring up a really good point. That's part of it, what I call discipline. Guys will tell me all the time, "Hey man, I just need to get confidence with the technique," and I gently discourage them from thinking that way. There really isn't a necessity for confidence in this presentation. It's execution. As accurate and as efficient as you can get casting that lure, and keeping your rod tip down, letting the line break surface tension, and rolling your reel handle over at a slow medium speed, the more disciplined you get with that, you actually shoot the odds up much higher to catch the fish. It's when you don't catch the fish is when you're feeling like you have to do everything with that spin bait. I'm going to throw it over here and rip it real quick, or I'm going to just buzz it along the surface, or and you start trying to find options, you actually take yourself way out of the game. So that's kind of the cool thing about it, is the guys that take on this challenge, if they can just kind of sit and be good to themselves, know that the cast is really critical. I got to make a good cast, get my line to sink, and then I'm going to apply that everywhere I go, whether I go to Florida or I go to Tennessee or I go to Texas. And I've spy baited so many different places in the nation. I was told one time at a show, and he's a friend now, but he at the time he came up to me and he said, "Hey, listen, David, tell me a little bit about spy baiting." So I gave him the rundown, and then he said, "Man, it sounds like a pretty good technique. When I go up to like smallmouth world, I think I may employ it." I said, no, this thing is, you can catch some big largemouth doing this. One of my big largemouth is almost 12 pounds or around 12 pounds. So I've caught some big fish doing this. And he kind of looked at me and said, "Well, you can't do that in Florida." I said, "No, you can spy bait in Florida." And he said, "Well, I don't want to fill you full of any hopes or dreams, but I'm just going to tell you realistically, it doesn't happen in Florida." And he walked away. 3 years later, he came up to me and he says, "Hey, you remember me?" And I go, "No." And it was at like a iCast or a Bassmaster Classic. And he says, "Well, I'm the guy who told you were full of blankety blank when you told me that you could spy bait in Florida." And I was like, "Oh no, here we go. This is going to be another heated conversation." And he goes, "And I was wrong." He goes, "I've won 2 tournaments spy baiting in Florida." I think it was Toho that he was doing it. And what he was doing was he knew where his topography was. He knew where the trees were, the laydowns were, where the cuts and the channels were in the grass, where the water went from shallow to deep, where there was clean water and where there was grassy water. He knew all that stuff where he was fishing. And he went behind guys that were using an A-rig and cleaned up behind them. So they'd use the A-rig, they'd get a couple fish, they'd keep going down the bank, and he'd get those fish. And the reason why he's getting those fish is because an A-rig and some other baits, like a big old 14-inch swim bait, will do this too. It'll actually pull fish from their location. So you can throw the bait and you'll see the draw effect on some of those baits just literally pulls those fish out of position, and then they get out and around off of their topography. Well, those fish are now suspended, kind of looking around. And he took advantage of that, clear advantage of it, and won 2 tournaments in Florida spy baiting. And I mean, when I say win, I mean he had like 7-pound fish that were eating this bait. So
Nice.
yeah, he put it together.
Now, I was gonna ask, I don't think you've touched on this yet, but you may have. Anyways, is there like a specific like water clarity that you kind of want for this technique?
Yeah, so to help guys get to a place where they were going to be comfortable with spy baiting, I kept everything clear water. Everything. I just said, listen, crystal clear water, blue skies. Those are really finesse ops, and you really want to pay attention to that. And that is true. That's 80% of the game. But you can spy bait in dirty water. I mean, you really can. There's some keys to that, like knowing exactly where the fish are. For example, if I know the fish are up against a stump in a stump row in a creek channel that the visibility is only 6 inches, I'm going to probably be able to catch those fish because I know exactly where they are. The bait does some things sonically that also happen. So the acoustics on that lure call fish out as well. So low light conditions, you can catch fish on it. For sure. But to really learn the technique, I say, go back to clear water, ultra finesse opportunities, and then that way you get dialed in. But I'll give you an example. I was out on the river one time, on the Columbia River, and that's a pretty big river. I fish about 300 miles of it, and it's like 1,200-mile river. But I was out there for 2 days straight fishing. Well, my last day, I was coming back in, and the sun had gone down, and and I marked some fish that were in about 24 foot of water. But the way they were acting, they just didn't look like, like perch. And so I could see some striations taking off. So it was almost like they were feeding on something. So I swung back around and I just kind of turned off my electronics. I knew about where the school was. And I just waited a couple minutes, just let everything quiet down. And then I made a cast, let it count down to about 20 feet. And I strolled that bait through, and it was cast after cast after cast. I caught smallmouth after smallmouth, and the sun had gone down. What I'm getting at is I usually don't catch fish on the Columbia River at nighttime. I usually don't. So and I've been out there to do that. I just don't usually get them. So these fish were suspended in that 20-foot zone, and I was able to count that bait down and stroll it through them, and they ate it. I mean, they ate it. Every time I brought it through, they bit it. So yes, clear water presentation, finesse ops are important. But once you master the technique, then you can start to sneak off and start fishing dingy water or targets that are in dirty water. And even we get into when's the greatest time to start spy baiting. Well, I like to spy bait early in the year, but you know as well as I do that there's a lot of different presentations that work for pre-spawn. You can throw a jig, right? You could pick up a jig for the next, if it's pre-spawn, you could pick up a jig for the next month and not touch another lure and have a great time with just a jig. So pre-spawn, there's plenty of opportunities to fish different ways, but I start spy baiting around that because sometimes I'm looking for those bigger fish. So I'll catch maybe the 2-pounders in the area. Well, before I leave that area, I will actually spy bait through there and see if I can get a big fish out of that with that tiny little lure, because those suspended fish will actually eat it in the spring or the pre-spawn, sorry. And then spawn, I'll fish it, and then post-spawn, I'll fish it, because now we have a hatch, going on, and we have little fingerlings in the water, and we've got bait in the water. And then summertime, we've got bait and secondary predators in the water. And so summertime, I'll fish it, and then fall, bait starts to concentrate again, and I'll fish it in the fall. Wintertime, I have caught fish rarely on it, and I know exactly why I caught those fish. So I have to say that I kind of give up about wintertime spy baiting because I can't seem to get on them on a consistent basis. So I may find a perch school, for example, sitting on a mud flat in about 24 foot of water. Well, I know I could probably spy bait that group and maybe catch a couple fish. But there's other ways that I can actually fish for those winter fish, bladed or drop shot or something. So wintertime, I tend to depart from spy baiting. But pre-spawn, spawn, post-spawn, summer or early summer, midsummer, and then the transition from summer to fall and then into fall. I kind of break up my seasons in 2s and 3s basically, but during that time frame, I'm on it if I can, for sure.
You mentioned fishing rivers. Do you do anything different in current than you would, say, if you were in a lake with not a ton of current? Or
yeah, I joke about this too. I say, if you're fishing current, keep running. Don't stop. Because the lure will probably tumble, right? Or it'll sink down. And so you'll make your cast and you'll get to the depth that you want. So you're going to let it sink down. And then you basically are kind of keeping on a semi-tight line as it's sinking. And then you just start moving it in. If you let it go slack all the way, it may go down and then hit different current pressure and rotate or do something and get onto the bottom. So I'll keep a little bit more line control on current, but I don't do too much of anything being different. I'm just making sure that I'm in contact with my lure. So I'll roll the reel handle over a little bit and keep a little bit of semi-tight line, let it sink, and then start my retrieve, just so that everything's lined out, because current's going to push the bait to me, for example. Now, I also fish the reverse. So I fish, into current. So I'll bring the bait. Once I do that, the bait just sits there and hovers in the current. So it'll just kind of do this in the current. I can stop retrieving even, and it'll just sit there and hover because of the pressure that's coming across the bait. So what I say, if you're going to fish that way in current, you want to make sure that you use a very, very slow retrieve, because the bait is fighting the current, so it's climbing. If you force that, it may rise. The bait may actually rise and take you out of the column. But by just slowly retrieving, you can kind of keep it in that one zone.
See, when you were initially talking about it, like I was thinking, like, yeah, you can't fish that in a river, and so now you got me even more excited.
Well, you know, guys would say, yeah, this is for, you know, going into a cove on a giant lake and like Clear Lake or something and catching fish when they're busting on shad. There was guys that were deferring to it in that way. But I was explaining to them that you could fish in the current. They kind of look at me and go, really? You can fish this in the current? The only thing you have to do is just make sure it doesn't tumble. So I was saying this in theory to all these guys. Now, I fished in the current all the time, so I already knew. I mean, one time I had my video crew out with me, and I put like 40 fish in the boat, cast after cast or almost cast after cast. I hit it just perfect. I strolled the bait just perfect, and I couldn't mess up. Now, I made it home late that night, and my wife got mad at me.
But it was worth it.
It was worth it, yeah. I mean, take your whooping when you can, man. But it was worth it. But fishing that way in the current was really kind of it was really illuminating for my filming crew. Those guys were like, whoa, I couldn't believe that you were doing that. You were lining everything up and still catching them. So a very famous guy spy-baited in a tournament in 2017. You all know him. And he won $20,000, and he was actually spy-baiting in current. I don't know if people knew that watching him, but I could tell how the boat was moving, that he was lined up in current, and he was keeping the bait moving, and he was whacking. I think he 6'2" or 6'4". That one tournament, I think the last day he caught the biggest fish of the tournament. But anyways, you guys know him as KVD, but he dabbled into spy-baiting too, and had one of his most epic tournaments ever. I mean, for smallmouth, and he'd been on that system for what, 20 years. So it was really cool watching. Now he's a phenomenal angler, so he could probably pick up any bait and catch fish, right? But when he decided to lock down on that particular presentation, he was pretty surgical with it, even in the current. I mean, he dialed down pretty quick. And then a year later, you know, a friend of mine, Chad Gripsey, won as well, and he won on a tour event and knocked it out of the park, almost 100 pounds of smallmouth, and the majority of those were spy baiting. So
now, are these sold in like Academy and Bass Pro and all that? Because I've never looked for them, but I don't think I've ever seen them.
Yeah, so it's always been a goal of mine to really get them in the mom and pop stores. And the reason why is I know those folks, some of these stores, you know, it's their retirement. It's kind of been their dream. So I do take that to heart. So my focal point has been with our company to really cater those guys and give them something that maybe is not really common. You know, it's not out there everywhere, and just kind of spoil them. The lures are expensive, obviously, at $14. They're between $13 and $14, but at the same time, it's more of kind of a heartfelt piece for me to try to get these stores to have first shot at them, and it also makes their relationship with their customers, I think, more enriched anyways, when you can bring them a quality bait. So that's where my focal point has been. There's some disadvantages to big box stores, but I mean, obviously we're not opposed to it, but we've just really tried to concentrate on doing the best we can to help those mom and pop stores out. So
I'm still waiting on my Tackle Warehouse order. So it's supposed to be here Thursday, and I think I ordered it like 2 weeks ago or something. So
oh yeah, Tackle Warehouse is a good. You know, another good store, if you don't mind me saying, is Carolina Fishing Tackle. It's a JDM store. Like, they have all this exotic Japanese bait and gear, and so if you really like to peruse that stuff, it's a great store to do that. The guy that started that store, I think he used to work in NASCAR or something, if I remember correctly, but really, really great guy, and he just loves lures. Like, he's like a kid. He doesn't even fish that much, but he'll see a lure, whoa, I really like this, and he'll bring it out and he'll display it. And so it's really kind of a cool passion of his. But his name's Doyle Myrick, and he owns the Carolina Fishing Tackle, and it's a knockout store, by the way. But that would be one of the mom and pop stores. Tackle Warehouse is a good online. But if the guys need any, I can dig up lists for them. We can find stores for them for sure.
Cool.
How about I know is there anything different you would say about fishing from a kayak? Because most of our audience tends to lean toward kayak fishing or at least small craft fishing. So
Sure. And I break this up into segments too. Fishing from the shore, there were some advantages when I used to fish from the shore that I applied to my bass boat fishing later on. The fact that I could get up on high points of land and look at topography, I could see fish and how fish position. So just fishing from the bank, I use that to my advantage. I may have to do a lot of walking, but I was able to eye spy places that maybe I would have never been able to hit or understand from a bass boat if I started out that way. So it gave me a great amount of respect for topography and how topography transitions into water and reading that versus my electronics per se. But I always say my first boat was a pair of Nikes, man. That was my first boat. So I get it. Small crafts like the kayak, I think spy baiting is almost ideal for kayak fishing because one, you have a tiny bait that you can cast anywhere. So it doesn't matter where you are on a body of water, you can cast that bait effortlessly. And from a kayak, you have a lower trajectory. So that bait being heavy and narrow pierces the air effectively. So you can do low trajectory casting without much change at all. So that bait, you can cast it from several different angles. So it makes it ideal for kayak fishing, in my opinion. The other thing about that is, I say the guys that fish out of kayak, and I fished out of them a couple times, not a whole bunch, and I've had some good days. But setting the hook, having your core in a kayak is different than when you're standing on your feet on a bass boat deck, right?
Oh yeah.
I can lock my legs and my hips, and I can turn my shoulders in a certain way and maximize my hook set. In a kayak, you really have to kind of prep yourself and get yourself ready. Your core is positioned a lot different. You don't have all that underneath you effectively unless you're standing up. And even then, you've got a distribution on the water from the keel that changes that and absorbs that energy. So for kayak guys, spy baiting may be an ideal in that regard, that you're not having to swing on these fish real hard and heavy. You're just reeling as fast as you can, letting the rod load up, and then putting the heat on them afterwards versus taking a big swing to set the hook. So you don't have to play the steel to them like that. You can allow the hooks to penetrate by just keeping line tension on them and a little bit of a reel seat hook set. So I think it plays perfectly to the kayaker for sure.
Awesome. Go ahead, Ryan. What were you gonna say?
I was gonna say in a kayak, you kind of gotta, to get like a strong hook set, you kind of gotta lean forward and then do that motion.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, you guys are in the kayaks a lot more than I am, I'm sure. But you don't have your hips to tie you in the same because your legs are out in front of you. So you just distributed your weight and your muscle mass differently. So you got to do so much from your torso. So you're absolutely right. But it makes it easier, I think, spy baiting from the water level too, because you can sidearm cast, you know what I mean, if you want to. And so you could probably, in my opinion, I would argue you could probably place a spy bait a little bit better in tight situations too, just by feathering the spool and doing sidearm casting. So you may be able to split some cover really easy, or much easier than the guy that's standing up on the bass boat for sure.
And speaking of cover, I remember you talking a little bit, hearing you talk about before. You are throwing a treble hook bait, so and you actually mentioned even potentially taking off the trebles and just casting it and learning how it feels, and so you don't get hung up as much or lose anything.
Absolutely, that idea came from, I was getting a bunch of guys tournament fishing that were like, man, I bought 3 of these and I lost all 3. And so I only had a certain amount of spy baits even in my tackle box. So I started telling guys, listen, and I used to do this anyways, but I told them, if you take the if you take the split ring and the hook off the bait, you'll still get the bait action. You'll be able to thread the needle, so to speak. You put that bait anywhere you want to in cover. And it may be that you get bit right down the center of cover, right? You put it in a tree and you get bit in the middle of the tree. Well, then you're probably not going to get that fish spy baiting. You may want to try to approach that fish differently. But if you're getting eaten 5, 6, 12 feet from the tree, then you can start to really get yourself dialed in to where you want to be when you put the treble hooks on. So the spy bait then becomes kind of part of your tooling for just getting yourself ready, and you don't lose those baits. However, when you do have the treble hooks on and it's tournament time, and I'll use this example, and let's say that you're fishing a erosion rock that kind of comes out and then flattens out, and you're fishing on that erosion rock. Well, treble hooks, if you put that spy bait down close to the rocks, it's that the first treble is going to catch the rock because they're on the bottom. So what you want to do in that case is, when you know you're committed to that type of cover, go ahead and drag the lure through the water, and you'll see the hook point that is sitting at the bottom of the lure. So like this. And then take your pliers and bend that hook point up against the shank. And now it becomes a bumper to get over rock, because that's the first place that lure will meet. So you can now negotiate that type of cover and get it over. And I did this by accident one day. I was actually fishing a flat, and I was using a crankbait on the flat, and I was catching fish like 1 out of every 4 or 5 casts. I'd catch a good fish. Those are tremendous odds, anyways. And I went back through with the spin bait. And it was every single cast on the same populace of fish, I was getting bit and fighting fish, except the ones where I actually hooked the rock. So then I had to go up and shake it off the rock. So quickly, the first thing I did was clip off that hook point. Well, the only problem with that is it doesn't give you everything. It makes the hook a little bit weaker. It doesn't have the integrity. And if I wanted to, I can bend that hook out when I put it up against the shank. So I lose that opportunity if I clip it. So I started bending it, creating a bumper, and then I could bump along that cover, get it over, negotiate that cover. And then if I'm done, I just really lightly move that hook back out, and it becomes part of the hooking up ratio that I used to have. So that's how I do it to negotiate that kind of cover, rocks and trees.
Awesome.
Yeah. I could talk to you guys all night long on this.
I just want to go out and try it. That's
yeah. Hey, you've pretty much inspired me to make a trip up to Dale Hollow, get some of that deep, clear water and give it a shot.
Oh, listen, true story. This is when I kind of first was releasing it. A guy had heard about it from Dale Hollow, and he said, "Man, do you think it'll work out there?" And I was like, "Yes, I promise you. If you've got fish out there, you can locate fish. If you got sections of the system that you know where the fish are, start practicing there first." And he went out and bought some, called me up, and he said, "Listen, in pre-fish, he had like some unbelievable weight. It was like 29 pounds of smallmouth or something. It was something unbelievable." Okay. And I was like, "And those are all smallmouth?" And he said, "Yeah." He said, "You asked that question twice." "Yes, they're all smallmouth." I was like, "Holy smokes." Well, I don't think he was that successful at tournament time because he never called back. But what I'm getting at is he had an epic, unprecedented day out there, Spybait. Yeah. I mean, it was insane. So I already know that it works at least part-time on Dale Hollow.
Well, I was going to say, aren't you supposed to stop after you catch a couple good fish and save those for the tournament day?
Yeah. Yeah.
But hey, if you're having a day like that, you just got to finish that out,
Yeah. Well, and I talk to guys about that too. That's another reason why, if you're practicing, maybe have one bait that doesn't have the treble hooks on it, and then have one that does. And you get to an area, let's just say you get to an area and they're just whacking the snot out of that no hook version. You can then pick up the hook version and see what type of fish you have eating the bait, and then rest your case and move on. But the negative part of spy baiting is it's a light line presentation. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to throw a lot of nitrogen in that fish's bloodstream, because you're not going to get them in right away. Can't horse these fish in on 20-pound tests. So you're playing and fighting these fish out, and they're going to fill up full of lactic acid, and pretty much that's it. They're done. So you do want to be very conservative when you're pre-fishing with it, for sure.
Interesting. That's something I would never have thought of, but that makes sense, because that's why you wear them out, I guess.
Yeah,
the same way with the person running, you build up your lactic acid and that kills you. So
yeah,
interesting.
We used to call it in track practice. We called it the bear. When the bear grabbed onto you, it was over. Your legs started to swell, and you looked like you were trying to run, and you weren't going anywhere. Yeah, I'm glad I don't have to do that anymore.
So I guess that kind of ties into, you said you were real big on like fish behavior. Yeah. We're gonna have to have you back on sometime to talk more about that, like just specifically fish behavior.
Yeah, it really does intrigue me, and obviously I don't have all the answers, but it really does. It blows me away how gifted these fish really are, and we forget it sometimes because they seem to be a simple animal. But I've watched fish do things that were unprecedented. Just my two lenses, no one else's, on just fun fishing. I've seen fish do things that I never thought they would do. I'll give you one example. One time I was fishing in a farm pond, and I watched a 2-pound bass race up on the shore, hit a blackbird in the chest, knocked the blackbird on its back. And usually when birds get touched or startled, they go into a reflex, and they just sit there and quiver as they're in shock. Sometimes they pull out of it and they fly away. Sometimes they don't. But you can startle them, and they'll get this startle reflex, and then they kind of stay in that mode. Well, anyways, this bass had seen this blackbird bathing in 2 inches of water, came rushing in and hit the bird in the chest, closed mouth. The bird fell on its back and started shaking because it was in shock. The bass turned around, rolled up and slid up on shore, was beached, literally beached, grabbed the bird, hung onto its feet, and started flopping back into the water. Now, it wasn't 20 feet offshore, but it was like 2.5 feet from the water's edge. This bass was, and had the bird by its feet and was flopping back, and eventually got back in the water. And there was nothing I could do. I was just sitting there in awe. And he pulled the bird in the water and took off with it. True story. So yeah, that
would have been awesome to see.
Oh, they're amazingly creative. They're amazingly creative. Yeah, I remember one time I was night fishing, when I say night fishing, I had a flashlight. Now, if my mom knew about this, she'd kill me. But I used to ask her if I'd spend the night at a buddy's house, and of course I would never let my son do this now, but my buddy would say, yeah, you could spend the night at my house. Well, his house was below the farm pond that I was fishing. I'd hike up in the farm pond. I'd fish it all night long. and then I'd come down to his house, get on my bike, and then I'd ride back. And if my mom knew, she would have probably died. But the reason why I fished all night long is because I was afraid of the dark. Anyway, I didn't want to lay down and go to sleep. I thought something was going to eat me. But
you go out to the pond where there's snakes that you can't see because it's dark.
Yeah. So one night I was fishing. I had a big old, I don't know if you guys remember him, but a jitterbug. But it was a giant one, almost like a musky jitterbug. And the thing was just blop 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 blop. And all of a sudden it was blop 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 and stopped. And I didn't hear anything else. No explosion. And the next thing, and this is in pitch dark, I was just using the skylight for reference when I was casting. My line started going straight up, and my rod tip started bending straight up. And I looking like this, I turn on my flashlight, and there's something up there with big wings that has my jitterbug in its talons. So I pull on it, because that's the only jitterbug I had, by the way. And so I pulled on it, give me back my jitterbug. This great horned owl falls to the ground, lands, and those things are giant. I don't know if you've ever seen them in person, but they're not tiny little owls. They are mean. They're stand like 3 feet tall, and it started hissing, and its beak was snapping together. And I still wanted my jitterbug, so I kept pulling on it, and he had it in his talons. And then eventually he just let it go and flew away. He never got a hook in him. So I I stayed in the fight as long as I could to get my jitterbug. Who knows
That's
what
an
I would
awesome
look
story.
like if he got really angry.
Oh, that's crazy. Well, Sean, did you have any more questions or anything?
I can't think of any right now, but yeah, dude, thanks so much for coming on. It's been awesome. Is there anybody you'd like to give a shout out to? Any
Well, again, I am your guys' fan. I'm giving you guys a shout out. Your show, Paddle and Finn. But I think it's really important that you guys are doing this. There's a lot of anglers out there that they're done with the shock factor that goes on in YouTube, and they really want to learn about fishing. So I think the shows, and maybe I'm old fashioned, but I think the shows that do cater to guys, you really are helping a populace become better anglers. And even that's always been one of my commitments. Getting into the industry, I always said if I ever get to a place where I want to be in the industry, I want to give back that way. When I was a tournament fisherman, you couldn't pry anything from me. but as a full-time tournament fisherman, but the more and more I see, there's a huge benefit. Conservation, one, just camaraderie, right? I mean, how many great people have you met in the industry? I know we got some pills in there too, but really, you get to meet a lot of different people that share in the same passion. It goes across races, it goes across languages, it goes across continents. It's an amazing, and I always say this, it's one of the best prescribed medicines that you could ever get from your doctor. So I want to see that sport continue, and I'd love to see our bass fishing stay strong. And so my hat goes off to you guys, actually.
I appreciate that. And like I 100% agree with what you were just saying. I've thought that for a while now. The country's like, the world, and the human race in general is just so divided, and all about race and religion and politics and all this stuff dividing us. And it seems like, if we're out there, if I see you out there fishing, it don't matter who you voted for. It don't matter, what color your skin is. It don't matter, who you worship. None of that matters. Like, did you catch a fish? What's your biggest fish you caught today? What are you catching them on? And like that, it's like brings people together.
It really does. I mean, I can honestly say there's definitely folks that I would have probably never met, being who I am, where I travel, what I do, if it wasn't for fishing. And I can say that, just thank you. I mean, it really is. And we have a lot of stuff. I won't get into the politicking, but we have a lot of stuff that's challenging us this day and age and making us look internally. But the one key thing I think we can come back to, I hate to say it, but we can come back to fishing. When I was out just 2 days ago on the water, and this guy rolled up next to me, and I could tell the guy doesn't even live remotely like I do. He was a lot cleaner. I'm a messy fool, and this guy looked polished, and we started talking about one thing, fishing, and we kind of shared little lures and techniques, and before you knew it, a couple hours passed, and we walked away. I may never see that guy again. I may never see him again, but it's a powerful. It really is a powerful thing. I introduced a technique. I'll tell you this real quickly, and I'll let you guys go because you guys have. Thank you for putting up with me. But
it's been awesome.
But I introduced a technique called flick shake, and you guys can go back and look at it. When I was with Jackal. I looked at that technique and actually. Started refining it a little bit too, added some things to it, but went back home to them and said, listen, can I name the technique flick shaking? And we did, and it took off on the tournament circuit. A lot of co-anglers really adapted that finesse presentation. Well, one day I was out on the Columbia River, and there's this man, I'm going to guess he's probably 80 years old, and he had like 4 rods and reels laying on the bank, and he was fishing with one. And up above him was his motorhome. And I walk alongside him. I said, do you mind if I fish next to you? And I was really trying to be courteous because I didn't want to intrude on him. But if he didn't mind me being there, maybe we could share in a conversation. And he started laughing at me. And I was like, well, golly, what's so funny? And he's like, you could stand right next to me all you want to. I've been here for 3 days and haven't caught a darn fish. So you can stand right here all you want to. And we did, and we sat and talked for a little bit. Well, flick shaking it's a really good finesse technique, or it's jig head wacky fishing, as a lot of guys know it too. I started catching the fish that were tight to the cover, and I started catching these fish right under his nose. And he just kept looking at me. And so finally I said, let me show you what I'm doing. So I grabbed one of his rods that would apply, cut off my bait, tied it on, showed him how to do the cadence. And within 3 or 4 casts, he started catching fish. Now, the funny part of the story is this is an 80-something-year-old man. He looked like a 6-year-old kid in a candy store. I mean, just elated, giddy about it. His wife comes out of the motorhome, stands up on top of that little cliff that she was standing on. She said, I can't remember his name. I'm just going to call him Harold. She says, Harold, get up here and eat your lunch. and he goes, no, I can't. She says, why not? And he says, I'm catching fish. She goes, yeah, right. And she goes back into the motorhome.
I think we all turn into that 6-year-old kid when we catch a fish. At least I know I do, man. And
oh yeah.
But you're right. And I love, I mean, I don't know how many times I tell my wife, oh, I'm going to be leaving at this time. And then I'll be pulling my kayak out up the boat ramp, and somebody will stop and just ask me a question, or, hey, that kayak's pretty cool. Can you tell me? And next thing I know, 45 minutes later, I'm calling the wife. I'm like, I'm not going to be home on time.
No doubt. Yeah. So great sport. Like I said, it's the best medicine. If you the guys and gals and young and old and whatever, if you're feeling a little pain, things that we're going through, I recommend that you cohabitate with guys that love to fish, and some of that stuff just gets dissipated, man, and it doesn't become the only thing that tends to tear you apart. So I get it. I honestly do, from all sides, from all walks, and fishing really does. It has no boundaries, man. I have people from South Africa, from Japan, other places that have flown out to fish with me, and some of them don't even speak a lick of English. I mean, it's just like 1 or 2 sentences or words, and they say bathroom, and I know I got to get them to the bathroom as quick as I can, But we're there sharing in that experience, and I enjoy it just as much as they do. It's a brand new experience each time, so definitely commend you guys for sure.
Did you have any social media you wanted to shout out where people can follow you and keep up with you?
Yeah, I keep getting yelled at that I haven't started a YouTube channel. So I have one in place. Now it's getting the time to do it, but it's called Angling Crew. I'm just telling guys, start subscribing now to it. I will eventually have content that'll be flowing through there where I'm going to do some educational stuff. If you go to Dual International, you'll see a series of videos that I do called Lures in Motion. That's to focus on the lure motion of the lure, so it gives guys a perspective about the lure. They're done quasi-entertainment value, but at least you get to look at that lure and say, I see now why that crankbait does what it does. So I have a series of those out. I also have a series that I'll be getting more called Advanced Lure Instruction. And there's one on YouTube now called Jerkbaits. It's Jerkbait Advanced Lure Instruction Jerkbait 1 and Advanced Lure Instruction Jerkbait 2. Both of those I think can be helpful to some anglers on learning about the idiosyncrasies to jerkbait fishing. And I've slipped some stuff in there that may not be privy to many folks too.
Awesome.
All right, man. Well, appreciate you coming on here once again. And
yeah, everybody go check out his videos. Check out Duo Realis. I can't wait to get mine and go out and try this. So
yeah,
you
on order.
keep me posted. I hit me up anytime. Your fans too. If you guys have any questions, I will try my best. Or your fans have any questions, I'll try my best to respond to them. It's just my Facebook is just David Swendseid. I think it says Dual Realis on there, something like that.
That sounded really weird to me. Said our fans, like I'm a nobody, okay? I'm just sitting here at the house, talking to people. We got listeners. We got listeners.
Hey, I'll take fans.
You got
if I can
fans
get
too. Yeah. Well, good luck to your show, and then scream at me anytime, you guys, if I can be of any help, for sure. And thanks for putting up with me.
Awesome. It was awesome having you.
Great, man.
Yeah.
All right, take care, you guys.
All right. You were gonna do the. You gonna take us down?
I was gonna ask if you wanted me to do the outro since you brought it in this time.
Go ahead, man.
All right. It's been Bass Fishing for Noobs, bringing you the techniques, tips, and tricks to help you rip more lips.
Nailed it.
Everybody.
See you guys.